The sky was the color of bruised steel when Elias stepped out of the barn, his breath clouding the air like smoke. The wind swept across the plains in long, mournful wails, carrying with it the scent of snow and distant pine. He stood still for a moment, hand braced on the wooden doorframe, as if listening to the land itself whisper warnings. He didn't need to be told what was coming. The horizon was a rolling wall of white, moving fast, swallowing the last strip of blue beneath a storm fury. Montana territory in winter didn't forgive mistakes, and tonight any error could be fatal. He turned back toward the cabin, boots crunching over the hard ground, and pushed the door open with a sharp creak. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning wood, smoke curling toward the low rafters. His mother lay on the cot near the fire, pale and sweating, one arm folded protectively over her ribs. Each breath came shallow, labored, like the rasp of a saw through old timber. The mule had kicked her earlier that afternoon, catching her square across the side, and the sound of breaking bones still echoed in Elias's mind. She tried to mask the pain for the children's sake, but she wasn't fooling him. Her eyes flicked toward him now, tired and worried, the way they always did when she didn't want him to see just how bad things were. The twins were crying again. Their tiny fists waved helplessly in the air, faces flushed, mouths open in thin, weak wails. They were only weeks old, born small and fragile. She had been nursing them every few hours, even through the night, but now she couldn't hold them without wincing. When she tried earlier, her breath caught so sharply that Elias thought she'd faint. She whispered something about her ribs being broken, about not being able to feed them anymore. The words hit him harder than the icy wind outside ever could. The babies needed her milk to survive. Without it, they wouldn't last long in this cold. He crossed to the hearth and crouched beside her. "Ma," he said softly. Her eyes flicked to him, glassy with pain. She tried to smile but couldn't. He reached for the tin cup of water and held it to her lips. She drank slowly, coughing once, then leaned back against the rough woolen blanket. "They are hungry," she whispered, voice barely audible over the fire's crackle. "I know," Elias replied, throat tightening. "I'll figure something out." Her hand found his, weak but warm. "You'll have to ride," she said. "Fort Benton. There's milk there, medicine, maybe a wet nurse. It's the only way." The thought of riding that distance in this weather knotted his stomach. Fort Benton was nearly 40 miles away, through forests, frozen rivers, and now a storm that was rolling in faster than he'd ever seen. He glanced at the door, at the white blur already dancing across the plains. His father used to make that journey once every month, bringing back salt, flour, sometimes news. His father had known the land like the back of his hand. But his father was gone. Bandits on the trail last spring had taken him, leaving Elias to step into shoes that still felt far too big. His mother squeezed his hand again, a silent plea. Her eyes said what she couldn't bring herself to speak. "If you don't go, they won't survive. None of us will." He stood slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like the gathering snow outside. He was 16, but in this moment he felt older, hardened by the quiet cruelty of frontier life. He crossed to the corner where his father's saddle and rifle hung on the wall. He ran his hand over the worn leather of the rifle strap. The memories came unbidden. His father's rough laugh, the way he'd shown Elias how to track deer through fresh snow, the night he'd handed him this very rifle and said, "You're a man now, boy. Protect them." Elias had tried to live up to those words. Now was the real test. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The toddler, Mary, stirred in her sleep in the corner, mumbling softly. He looked at her and the twins, all innocent and unaware of how close the edge of disaster lay. His heart twisted painfully. He couldn't let them die here. Not like this. He packed quickly, movement sharp and deliberate. A wool blanket, a small sack of jerky and hard bread, the canteen, the spare bullets, and the flint. He wrapped his father's rifle in oilcloth to keep it dry. He laid on his heavy coat, the one with a fur lining that smelled faintly of pine and horses. Every decision carried weight. There was no room for mistakes. His mother tried to sit up when he returned to her side, but pain forced her back down. "Elias," she rasped, gripping his sleeve, "you have to hurry, before the trail disappears." He nodded. "I'll be back. I promise." Her eyes softened. filled with something between pride and fear. "You're your father's son." The words burned through him like fire against the cold. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then gently adjusted the blanket over her. He looked at the twins one last time. Their cries had grown weaker. He knew what that meant. Time was slipping away. In the barn, the mare shifted nervously. It was flicking toward the sound of the storm. She was old but steady, a chestnut with a white blaze down her nose. He spoke to her softly as he saddled her, calming both her and himself. The snow was already drifting across the ground in pale ribbons. He led her out, tightened the cinch, and climbed into the saddle, breath steaming into the freezing air. As he rode away from the cabin, he didn't look back. He couldn't. If he did, he might turn around, and that wasn't an option. The wind tore at his hat, stung his face, filled his ears with its relentless howl. The trail stretched ahead, a faint line disappearing into the trees. He urged the mare into a trot, then a cautious canter, heart pounding in rhythm with her hooves. The forest swallowed him quickly. Tall pines loomed like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. The world narrowed to the sound of the mare's breathing, the creak of the saddle, and the storm closing in behind him. He focused on the path, on keeping his bearings. His father had taught him the landmarks, the split cedar, the frozen creek, the ridge shaped like a wolf's head. If he could follow those, he'd reach the main trail before the blizzard made it impossible. Hours passed like a slow grindstone. The snow deepened, flakes swirling so thick they stung his eyes and blurred the world into shades of white and gray. The mare stumbled once, catching herself just before falling. Elias leaned forward, whispering encouragement. He couldn't afford to lose her. Without her, he'd never make it. The wind grew fiercer, pushing against him like a living thing. His fingers went numb despite the gloves. His face burned where the cold bit through. He started to doubt. Doubt crept in like the chill, quiet but insidious. What if he got lost? What if the storm buried the trail? What if he never made it to Fort Benton? His mind conjured images of his family, the cabin half buried in snow, the babies silent, his mother still and pale. He shook his head violently, forcing the thoughts away. He couldn't afford fear. Fear would slow him down, make him hesitate. And hesitation meant death. Somewhere near the ridge, the mare slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. It happened fast. One moment they were moving, the next her hooves skidded, and Elias was thrown forward. He grabbed the reins instinctively, clinging on as the mare lurched dangerously close to the edge of a small ravine. Snow crumbled beneath her hooves, and for a heartbeat it felt like the entire world tilted. His stomach dropped. The reins burned his hands as he hauled back with everything he had. The mare scrambled, legs flailing, before finding purchase on solid ground. She whinnied, breath steaming, eyes rolling in panic. Elias slid from the saddle, chest heaving. He pressed his forehead against the mare's neck, whispering soothing words, feeling the tremor in her muscles mirror his own. That was too close. One more slip like that, and they'd both be broken at the bottom of that ravine, lost to the snow and the wolves that prowl these woods after dark. He looked up at the sky. The storm was nearly upon him, a wall of white swallowing the ridge. He could feel it in his bones, the way the air seemed to tighten, the way sound dulled beneath the heavy snow. Fort Benton felt impossibly far. But going back wasn't an option. His family was waiting, depending on him. He straightened slowly, brushed the snow from his coat, and climbed back into the saddle. He set his jaw against the wind and pressed on into the storm, a lone figure swallowed by the wilderness, carrying hope like a fragile flame against the darkness. The storm raged through the night like a living thing, clawing at the trees and scouring the land clean. By the time the first gray light filtered through the heavy clouds, the forest was silent except for the soft groan of branches bending under the weight of fresh snow. Elias awoke to the brittle cold pressing against his skin and the sharp ache in his shoulders from where he'd leaned against the mare for warmth. His eyelashes were crusted with frost. His breath came in shallow clouds. The mare stood a few feet away, one leg bent awkwardly, her flank heaving. She had slipped again in the darkness, and though she'd stayed upright, the stumble had left her limping. Elias knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he examined the injured leg. No break, thank God, but swelling had set in, and she'd never carry him at full pace now. He straightened slowly, scanning the pale woods. Everything was muffled, the world wrapped in a thick, almost eerie hush. Even the usual cries of bird were absent. He could feel exhaustion pulling at him like heavy chains. He'd ridden hard through the night until the storm forced him to take shelter under a rocky outcrop. He hadn't dared to build a fire, not with the wind howling and the snow drifting high around them. Now every muscle screamed for rest, but there was no time to waste. His family was counting on him. The twins were crying when he left. By now their tiny bodies would be growing weaker without milk. His mother's voice, ragged and pained, echoed in his memory. "You'll have to ride. It's the only way." He gathered what little he had salvaged after the night's ordeal, his canteen, the wrapped rifle, and the sack of food that had been half buried under the snow when the mare stumbled. He forced himself to chew a piece of hard bread, not because he wanted it, but because he needed the strength. The cold gnawed at his resolve, seeping into his bones. He wrapped the mare's injured leg as best he could with a strip torn from his blanket, and then led her forward at a slow, halting pace. The forest grew denser, the trees closing in overhead like a cathedral of ice. Hours bled together in a rhythm of crunching snow, labored breathing, and the soft thud of hooves. Elias's thoughts began to scatter, drifting like the snowflakes that clung to his eyelashes. He kept seeing his mother's face, pale and strained, kept hearing the soft, fading cries of the babies. It drove him forward long after his body wanted to stop. Somewhere deep in those woods, a wolf howled, long and low, the sound stretching through the frozen air. It didn't sound close, but it didn't need to. The knowledge that predators were out there, watching, added a sharp edge to his fear. By midday, the pain in his legs had settled into a dull throb. He reached the frozen creek that marked the halfway point to Fort Benton, but crossing it with a mare in her state was dangerous. He tested the ice with the butt of his rifle, listening to the hollow creaks. The water beneath moved sluggishly, thick and black. He led the mare carefully, step by step, whispering to keep her calm. Halfway across, the ice groaned louder, a deep, warning sound that made his stomach clench. He urged her on quickly, heart hammering. When they reached the other side, he exhaled shakily, realizing he'd been holding his breath the entire time. Not long after, exhaustion finally caught up with him. His legs buckled, and he slumped to his knees beside a tree, chest heaving. He wanted to stand, to keep going, but his limbs wouldn't obey. He leaned against the trunk, the bark biting through his coat, and let his eyes close just for a moment. The cold seeped in quickly, dangerous and patient. He knew he couldn't sleep for long. Sleep in weather like this could mean death. The sound of movement snapped him back to alertness. It was faint, a soft crunch in the snow that didn't belong to the wind or the mare. Elias froze, every sense sharpening. He reached slowly for the rifle, fingers stiff. Another sound, a footstep this time, deliberate and heavy. He turned his head and saw a figure emerging from between the trees, tall and wrapped in furs, moving with the quiet ease of someone who belonged to this wilderness. The stranger's presence was commanding, like a shadow that had decided to take shape. Elias scrambled to his feet, rifle raised, though his arm shook. The stranger stopped a few paces away, his face partially hidden beneath a hood lined with wolf fur. His eyes, dark and watchful, studied Elias with a calm that made Elias's heart pound faster. He didn't look like a bandit. He didn't look like a settler either. The pattern stitched into his clothing, the way he carried himself, told Elias he was native, a warrior, perhaps, from one of the tribes that still roamed these parts. For a long moment, neither moved. The only sound was the wind rustling through the branches. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the stranger lifted his hands away from his weapons and took a step closer. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle, unsure whether to trust him or fire. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he pointed toward the mare's injured leg, then back at Elias, as if asking permission to approach. Elias hesitated, torn between fear and desperation. His mare couldn't go on much longer without help, and this man clearly knew the land far better than he did. Slowly, he lowered the rifle a fraction. The stranger closed the distance, knelt by the mare, and examined the swelling with practiced hands. He murmured something Elias couldn't understand, a low chant, and applied pressure in certain places that made the mare snort but settle. He pulled a small pouch from his belt, sprinkled some kind of powdered herb over the wound, then bound it tightly with leather strips. His movements were precise, confident. When he finished, He looked at Elias again, as if assessing him. Elias swallowed hard, feeling suddenly young and small beneath that steady gaze. "Thank you," he managed, voice hoarse. The man didn't respond in English, but he gave a short nod, then gestured toward the woods, indicating Elias should follow. Elias hesitated. He had a mission. He had to reach Fort Benton. But the storm had taken its toll, and he wasn't sure he could survive another night out here without help. The stranger seemed to sense his indecision. He pointed to the darkening sky, then to Elias's shivering hands. The meaning was clear. "Follow me if you want to live through this." Elias finally nodded. The stranger turned and began walking, silent as a shadow. Elias led the man followed. They moved deeper into the forest, through a narrow ravine that twisted like a serpent. Eventually, they reached a small hollow tucked beneath an overhang of rock, almost invisible from the outside. Inside was a small, well-hidden camp. A fire burned low, its smoke carefully funneled through cracks in the rock to avoid detection. A pair of pelts hung drying on a line. Everything about the place spoke of skill and survival. The stranger gestured for Elias to sit near the fire. Elias obeyed gratefully, holding his hands close to the flames, feeling life slowly return to his numb fingers. The man worked silently, tending to the mare, then preparing some kind of broth over the fire. Elias watched him, curiosity mixing with caution. He'd heard stories about alliances and conflicts between settlers and tribes, about raids and trade and uneasy truces. But here, in the heart of the forest, it wasn't politics that mattered. It was survival. As the evening wore on, the man finally spoke a few words in broken English. "You, far from home." Elias nodded. "Fort Benton. Family. Need help." He mimed a baby crying, his mother's pain. The man watched carefully, understanding dawning in his eyes. He spoke his name slowly, Tamaqua. Elias repeated it, and the man gave a slight nod of approval. Tamaqua didn't ask for more details, but his expression shifted slightly, softening. He understood desperation when he saw it. As they shared the simple meal, Elias felt the weight of his loneliness ease just a little. Tamaqua was still a stranger, but there was something steady about him, something that made the raging wilderness seem less overwhelming. Later that night, as the fire crackled softly and snow drifted past the entrance of the hollow, Elias found himself speaking quietly, more to the darkness than to Tamaqua. He spoke of his father's death, of his mother's injury, of the helpless cries of the twins. He admitted his fear, the kind he'd tried so hard to bury. Tamaqua listened in silence, face unreadable, but when Elias's voice faltered, the warrior nodded once, slow and solemn, as if acknowledging the weight of his words. In return, Tamaqua spoke briefly, his English halting but his meaning clear. He had lost his family to violence and sickness brought by settlers. His village was gone. He had chosen to live alone in these woods, a guardian of a world that was slipping away. Their pain, though born of different histories, was shared, and in that shared pain, something like understanding began to take root. Before dawn, they heard distant gunshots echo through the forest, sharp, unnatural cracks that didn't belong to the storm or the wildlife. Tamaqua stiffened instantly, his hand going to the knife at his belt. Elias felt his pulse quicken. Bandits, most likely. The roads to Fort Benton were dangerous, and winter made desperate men bolder. Tamaqua motioned for silence, listening intently. The shots came again, then faded. Elias looked at him, uncertain. Tamaqua's eyes were dark with thought. He pointed in the direction of the sound, then toward the trail Elias needed to follow. The implication was clear. Trouble lay ahead. If Elias continued alone, he would almost certainly run into them. For the first time since he'd set out, Elias didn't feel entirely alone. The storm had stripped him down to his bare will to survive. This stranger had given him shelter, healed his horse, and listened to his fears. Whether he liked it or not, their paths were now intertwined. He glanced at Tamaqua, then at the darkness beyond their hidden camp. The journey wasn't over. If anything, the real dangers were only beginning. The storm had left its mark across the land, blanketing the forest in silence and cold so deep it seemed to press into Elias's very bones. His mare limped beside him, every step cautious and painful, steam rising faintly from her nostrils. He moved with her, one hand on the reins, the other gripping the rifle for balance, though his arms ached and his breath rasped from fatigue. His thoughts narrowed to one thing alone: keep walking. If he stopped, the cold would swallow him, and then there would be no one left to bring help to his mother and the babies. The forest grew denser as he pressed deeper into it. Pines loomed like solemn guardians, branches weighed down by snow, their needles dripping ice. Time blurred, measured only by the rhythm of his boots breaking through crusted drifts. He no longer knew if it had been hours or minutes since he last looked at the pale gray sky. His vision swam. He staggered once, caught himself against a tree, and tried to swallow down the creeping fear that his strength was running out. Then came the sound, a crunch in the snow that was not his own, slow and deliberate. His heart leapt into his throat. He toned sharply, rifle raised despite the tremor in his arms. From between the trees, a figure emerged, tall, cloaked in furs, face shadowed beneath a hood lined with wolf hide. He moved with a confidence Elias recognized instantly, the confidence of someone who belonged here. The man paused a few paces away, his eyes dark, watchful, unreadable. Elias's breath hitched. He thought of bandits, of raiders, of every warning his father had ever spoken about strangers in the wilderness. Yet this man's presence didn't carry the chaotic hunger of desperation. It carried stillness, like the hush before dawn. He lifted his hand slowly away from his weapons and gestured toward the mare's injured leg. Elias kept the rifle trained, though doubt flickered. The stranger knelt, not rushing, his movement precise and calm. From a pouch he drew herbs, pressed them into the swelling, and bound the leg with strips of leather. The mare shifted uneasily, then stilled. Elias watched, torn between mistrust and the undeniable skill before him. When the man finally straightened, his gaze returned to Elias. His voice came, low and halting in broken English, to Makwa. He tapped his chest, then waited. Elias swallowed, then answered, Elias. The faintest nod acknowledged the exchange, and silence returned, punctuated only by the hiss of wind through the pines. Makwa gestured toward the deep woods, then at Elias, his meaning clear, follow me. Elias hesitated. Every instinct told him not to trust too quickly, yet exhaustion and need gnawed at his resolve. Alone, he would not last long. Slowly, he lowered the rifle and gave a nod. They traveled together in silence, Makwa leading with a hunter's grace, Elias trailing with a limping mare. The path wound through ravines and ridges until at last they reached a hollow hidden beneath an overhang of stone. Smoke curled faintly from a small, careful fire. The camp was neat, efficient, pelts drying on a line, tools set in order. It was not the place of a drifter, but of someone who knew how to carve life from the wild. By the fire's glow, Elias thawed his frozen fingers. The warmth biting almost painfully, a sensation returned. Makwa tended to the mare again, then ladled the thin broth into a wooden bowl and handed it over. Elias drank greedily, the heat filling him, strength trickling back into weary limbs. Gratitude stirred in him, but so did unease. Who was this man? Why had he helped him? He dared to speak, words rough in his dry throat. Family, sick, need Fort Benton. He mimed holding a baby, the weak cries. Makwa's eyes softened with understanding, though he said little. As night thickened, Elias found himself speaking more than he'd intended, words tumbling out like stones from a broken wall. He spoke of his mother's injury, of the twins too weak to last without milk, of the fear that he would fail them. His voice faltered when he spoke of his father, killed by raiders, and of the burden that had fallen on his shoulders since. Makwa listened in silence, expression unreadable but intent. When Elias finally grew quiet, ashamed of his own outpouring, the warrior spoke a few words of his own. His English was fractured, but the meaning was clear. He too had lost family, disease, raids, the slow erosion of a life swept away by forces larger than any man could stop. Their grief was different, yet it rhymed, and in that shared rhythm lay the first fragile thread of trust. The night was broken by distant gunshots, sharp and alien against the stillness. Both men stiffened, heads turning. Makwa's hand went to the knife at his belt, his posture suddenly taut. Elias felt fear crawl icy fingers down his spine. Gunshots meant men, outlaws, most likely, haunting the winter trails in search of prey. Makwa's gaze turned toward the direction of the sound, then back to Elias. He pointed. first at the trail ahead, then at the source of the shots. His meaning was plain. Danger lay between Elias and Fort Benton. The fire crackled softly between them as they sat in the hollow, the world outside heavy with snow and silence. Elias looked at Tamaqua and knew the truth. He could not do this alone. His family's survival now hung not only on his determination, but on this stranger, this solitary warrior whose past was as scarred as his own. The bond between them was unspoken, fragile, but real. Tomorrow would demand more of them both. And as Elias closed his eyes against the fire's glow, he understood that the storm had not been his greatest trial. What waited on the road ahead, the bandits, the wilderness, the choices yet to come, would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. The forest breathed around them, the snow falling in steady silence, and somewhere beyond the ridges, danger was already stirring. Elias, for the first time since he had left home, felt the faintest spark of hope and the heavy shadow of what still lay before him.